To present your moderator for this panel, who will be also a panelist later on, Milena Stereo, from down the street at Cleveland State University School of Law. We have collaborated on many, many things, and it's always a pleasure to have her involved in our project.
Thank you. Good morning, and welcome to this panel entitled, What Constitutes the Katyn Crime? It is my pleasure to introduce the topic of this panel as well as our distinguished speakers. As you have heard from the previous speakers and panels, in the spring of 1940 at the Katyn forest, as well as at a few other sites, the Soviet secret police murdered close to 22,000 Polish soldiers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and some members of the Polish intelligentsia whom Stalin wanted to eliminate so that Poland would be cleansed of those capable of offering any meaningful resistance to Stalin's oppressive regime during and after the war. This panel will seek to decipher what constitutes the Katyn crime. Professor Kenneth Ledford will speak first about the Nazi discovery of the mass graves at Katyn and the Third Reich attempt to use this discovery towards their advantage. Professor John Barrett will speak about Justice Jackson's role at the Nuremberg Tribunal and his willingness to charge the Germans with the Katyn crime, as well as his subsequent testimony before the Madden Committee in 1952. Finally, Maria Schonert will concentrate on the scope of the Katyn crime. Now, before yielding the floor to our panelists, let me briefly highlight some of their accomplishments. Professor Kenneth Ledford is a professor of history and law here at Case Western Reserve University. He teaches German history, European legal history, the history of European legal professions, and the history of European Union law. He received his BA with honors in history and a JD with honors from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he was a Moorhead Fellow in law. And after practicing law for 4 years in Richmond, Virginia, he received his MA and PhD in modern German and European history from the Johns Hopkins University. He is an editor of Central European History, which is published by the Conference Group for Central European History of the American Historical Association. Professor John Barrett is a professor at St. John University School of Law. He teaches constitutional law and legal history. He's the Elizabeth S. Lena Fellow and a board member of the Robert Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and Harvard Law School. He's a renowned teacher, writer, lecturer, and public commentator in the United States as well as internationally. Professor Barrett's regular Jackson List email, which pertains to Justice Jackson, Nuremberg, the Supreme Court, and related topics, now reaches over 100,000 readers across the world. Last but not least, Maria Schonert is the founder and president of Libra Institute. She's also the president of the Cressy Siberia Foundation, USA. She's a law graduate of the University of Warsaw and Rutgers University, and she has worked as corporate counsel as well as a USAID capital market specialist for Europe and newly independent states. She has also served as vice president and corporate counsel for Key Corporation in Cleveland. For the past decade, she has been publishing extensively, working with journals, papers, as well as a leading Polish language cultural weekly magazine. Now, each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then hopefully at the end of this session we'll have time for questions and answers from the audience. So without further ado, Professor Ledford.
Thank you. On April 9th, 1943, Joseph Goebbels exulted in his diary over the uncovery of mass graves near Smolensk. Goebbels resolved to incorporate this grisly discovery into his ongoing anti-Bolshevik propaganda focus of the late winter and spring 1943, aimed to distract attention from the reeling retreat of the Wehrmacht in the east after the crushing defeat at Stalingrad in February, and of the Afrika Korps in North Africa. He saw a chance to use this news to address three audiences: the Polish population in the so-called general government of Poland, the Western allies of the Soviet Union, specifically Britain and the United States, and the increasingly pessimistic German population in a campaign that has been called Strength Through Fear, Kraft durch Furcht. Goebbels embarked upon a publicity campaign to spread before the world the perils of Bolshevik success. A later entry in his diary, "One hardly dares to imagine what would happen to Germany and Europe if the Asiatic Jewish flood were to inundate our country and our continent. All hands must be put to work to the last breath to prevent such a misfortune. He undertook a multi-pronged propaganda campaign, literally to unearth the facts about the murdered Polish officers uncovered in the Katyn forest. And he framed a narrative that aimed to disrupt the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany. And the entire propaganda campaign embodied a cynicism breathtaking even for Goebbels. For the Nazi discovery of Soviet crimes against leadership segments of Polish state and society elided the reality that from the very beginning of the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, SS action groups, Einsatzgruppen, carried out mass murders of Polish intellectuals and other social leaders identical to the Soviet crime that the Wehrmacht uncovered at Katyn. Goebbels' campaign amounted to mass murderers uncovering mass murders on the part of their adversaries and seeking cynically to use that shocking discovery to the advantage of the Third Reich. Today, I want to situate the Nazi campaign to instrumentalize the Katyn discovery to German advantage in 3 steps. First, I want to sketch the events leading up to the Katyn massacre in April 1940 and the Nazi discovery of the victims in late March 1943. Second, I want to examine the course and substance as well as the immediate consequences of Nazi propaganda exploitation of the Katyn massacre to promote Goebbels' ends. And third, I want to position Katyn in the bloody 20th century history of East Central Europe as a cockpit of genocide that Timothy Snyder has recently called the Bloodlands. First to the massacre and the Nazi discovery. Timothy Snyder's persuasive new synthesis of the history of East Central Europe in the middle of the 20th century argues that the region from central Poland to western Russia through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states experienced a coordinated orgy of political mass murder from 1932-33 until the end of the war in 1945, and extensive oppression thereafter until at least the death of Stalin in 1953. A horror whose extent and enormity, Snyder argues, has been overshadowed by accounts of the focused murder of Jews in the Holocaust. Current scholarship thus rightly returns the murder of the Polish intellectual and social elite in the professional and reserve officer corps at Katyn and elsewhere to its integral place as an episode within 3 decades of criminality. And the recontextualization of Katyn not only settles long open questions about its facts, but explains better how it could have occurred. Snyder details in excruciating clarity Soviet enmity toward Poles and Poland that extended back at least to the Polish-Soviet War of 1920-21, Stalin's focus on the murder of Polish citizens of the Soviet Union during the Great Purge of 1937-38, and the eagerness of the Soviets to extend their border westward at the expense of Poland that led to the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939. And finally, this broadened context also clarifies how the NKVD enjoyed literally millions of opportunities to perfect the logistical and bureaucratic techniques necessary to render individualized mass murder by pistol shot in the nape of the neck, both efficient and expeditious. But the more immediate context of the Katyn massacre, of course, were the successive invasions of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in September 1939. On September 28th, their conquests complete, Foreign Ministers Ribbentrop and Molotov signed the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Demarcation, modifying the previously agreed-upon territorial division and extending the western border of the Soviet Union westward into interwar Poland, and delivering at least 100,000 Polish prisoners of war into Soviet captivity, including the officers who died at Katyn. But as I've indicated, from the very beginning of their own invasion of Poland, the Nazis had planned mass murder of Poles. Hitler had instructed his army commanders on August 22nd, 1939, that, quote, "The annihilation of Poland is in the foreground. The goal is the elimination of the living forces, not the attainment of a certain line," close quote. So troops of the German Wehrmacht, the army itself, murdered Polish soldiers who had surrendered, murdered civilians, raped, and plundered as they advanced. But Nazi racial fixation on the elimination of so-called inferior races, including Poles, had also led to the organization of the Einsatzgruppen that accompanied the army into Poland, although with the different mission of decapitating Polish society by murdering Polish intelligentsia as well as Jews, a plan called Operation Tannenberg. Before the dissolution of the Einsatzgruppen on November 20th, by which point German-occupied Poland had been pacified, in quotation marks, these groups had murdered at least 42,000 to 50,000 Poles. And all of this murder, of course, was only prelude to massive Nazi plans to conduct ethnic cleansing of Poles from the western part of their territory, the so-called Warthegau, by expelling them to the east to provide empty farmland on which to resettle Germans. Thus, when the Soviets in September 1939 began to arrest, deport, and execute Polish intellectuals in their occupied zone of Poland, their policy differed in no way from that of Germans in Poland to the west. These purges and murders by the Soviets of Poles as Poles, which merely continued the policies of the murders of the Great Purge, as well as Soviet policy toward officers among the Polish prisoners of war, only culminated in the murders at Katyn and other sites in the spring of 1940. Together, these campaigns show neither any new departure in Soviet policy nor any differentiation of Soviet from Nazi policy. But of course, the framework situation and the lineup of interests changed radically when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Suddenly, the Soviets became not only the allies of the British, but of the Polish government in exile in London, which had a vital interest in the whereabouts of the 1939 POWs, as did the British, who were desperate for troops to put into battle against the Germans. Conversely, the German invasion of the Soviet Union turned erstwhile allies and accomplices into enemies. The lightning German advance toward Moscow reached beyond Smolensk in late July 1941, behind schedule but still remarkably swift. Secure in the rear, Signal Regiment 537 of Army Group Center set up its operations near a bend in the Dnieper River west of Smolensk at a wood called Katyn, near a train station called Gniezdowo. I apologize to all the Poles. I don't speak Polish, so you're going to get German pronunciations of Polish and other place names. During the summer of 1942, Polish forced laborers in the Katyn forest heard rumors from Russians that Polish countrymen had been murdered by the Soviets nearby. On their own time, these workers began to excavate, finding human remains, and they marked the spot with a wooden cross, but they did not report their discovery to the German authorities. The German commander, Colonel Friedrich Ahrens, later recalled that during the winter of 1943, he thought January or February, he tracked a wolf through the woods and discovered it had been digging on the mound with the wooden cross. And he directed his troops to investigate as to the kind of bones contained in the mound and was informed by doctors that they were human. He reported this discovery to Army Group Center in late February, which dispatched Professor Dr. Gerhard Butz, a forensic pathologist, formerly professor of forensic pathology and criminology at the center, at that pathological center at the University of Wrocław, and currently, at the time, on the medical staff of Army Group Center. He was sent to investigate. Boots on March 1st began to plan to exhume the graves and conduct autopsies on the remains found in them. But the harsh freeze of winter delayed the actual start of work until March 29th. By the time of an interim report on April 10th, in a single grave, workers had uncovered 12 layers of 250 corpses each, for a total of 3,000 dead. In this interim report, out of 100 corpses, 65 had been identified by means of identity cards, diaries, or letters in their pockets, or otherwise, and 39 of the 65 were clearly Polish army officers. Excavation continued at 7 graves through June the 1st, resulting in the discovery of 4,143 corpses, of whom 2,815 had in June been clearly identified. And the clothing of the dead was plainly recognizable as Polish army uniforms. Although news of the discovery initially remained within the chain of command of the Wehrmacht and the Feldpolizei, by early April, the word had reached the Reichspropaganda Ministry in Berlin, where Goebbels himself learned of it on April 1st or 2nd. And he knew he had a prime propaganda opportunity and determined to exploit it carefully. Before announcing the discovery to the world, he arranged for a delegation of Polish leaders to fly from Warsaw, Krakow, Lublin to Smolensk on April 10th, where they were taken to the Katyn forest and shown 2 excavations from which 250 bodies had already been exhumed. The next day, his propaganda effort began with the first mention of the discovery of the graves by a German news agency, which evoked a reply in a pro-Soviet Polish language radio broadcast from Moscow. But it was the Berlin radio broadcast of April 13th which placed the discovery before world media, describing it as a place in which the Bolsheviks had secretly perpetrated mass executions and where the GPU had murdered 10,000 Polish officers. On April 15th, the Soviets denied their guilt, denouncing the, quote, vile fabrication by German fascist murderers. And on April 17th, the Polish government issued a statement of grave concern, condemning the murders while denouncing German hypocrisy and exploiting them in consideration of German crimes against Poles and Poland. Although the Germans quickly agreed to a Polish government proposal for an investigation by the International Committee for the Red Cross, the ICRC conditioned its involvement on the invitation of all states involved, and there was clarity that the Soviets would not agree to such an investigation. The Polish Red Cross, under German pressure in the general government, and despite reservations and concerns about being used for German propaganda purposes, sent a technical commission, as well as its secretary, to Katyn on April 14th, where it was augmented by additional members on the 19th, and where it worked on the site until June 7th, when it produced a final report. Alongside the teams commanded by Boots and the Germans and the Polish Red Cross, a third group of experts, an international physicians commission invited by the Germans and consisting of forensic pathologists from 12 German allies or states occupied or surrounded by Germany, there was a Swiss, and 7 of these physicians conducted autopsies on April 28th and 30th. Although some work at the site continued until June of 1943, by the end of April, the essential facts had been framed. And it's to the propaganda effort to propagate these facts, to have them believed, and to shape the effect that I now turn. Goebbels sought to exploit the Katyn discovery as part of a propaganda of pessimism that he began after Stalingrad, and which is perhaps best immortalized in his February 18, 1943 Sportpalast speech, "Do you want total war?" In doing this, Goebbels sought to address 3 audiences: the Poles in the general government, in an effort to mobilize them to side with the Germans in defense against the onrushing Red Army; the Western Allies, in an effort to sow dissension between them and their Soviet ally on the already contentious issue of post-war Poland, and to undermine the recently announced policy of unconditional surrender and open the possibility of Germany making a separate peace with one side or the other. And finally, the German people, to steel them for increased defensive effort by instilling in them fear of the consequences of a Soviet victory. Goebbels began with a press campaign to vilify the Soviets and deepen the Nazi rhetorical motif that equated Bolshevism and Jews. The Nazi newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, resounded with articles titled "The Mass Murder of Katyn, the Work of Jewish Butchers," and "Judah's blood guilt grows to the unfathomable, unermesslich." He worked with care to include gruesome footage of the exhumations and autopsies in the weekly newsreels, and expressed his frustration when the German army prevailed in excluding the shots out of concern for the feelings of families of German soldiers also reported to be missing and captured. Might they have met the same fate? Goebbels succeeded in screening a widely viewed documentary film, Invalde von Katyn. And the German Foreign Office contributed by releasing in fall 1943 a massive book-length publication, Official Material on the Mass Murder at Katyn, 331 pages long, consisting of affidavits, reports, photographs, and a detailed listing by name of all 4,143 dead. An undated propaganda pamphlet, but clearly from 1943, reproduced the report of the International Physicians Commission and a collection of stark photographs, and its text concluded, "The chapter of Katyn is closed. It will live on as the greatest and most brutal mass murder in world history, but it is only one, albeit an especially gruesome case, of Jewish Bolshevik practice of murder, Mordpraxis. Katyn is a dreadful textbook example of what Bolshevism, with the silent support of England and America, would do in Europe if Bolshevism and its Jewish executioners were to succeed in penetrating into the West and inundating the civilized lands of Europe. If that were to happen, the mass grave of tomorrow would no longer be called Katyn, but rather Europe." On one level, this propaganda campaign paid dividends, and Goebbels certainly took credit for it. When the Polish government's request for an ICRC investigation coincided in time with a German request, Stalin took the opportunity to denounce the Poles as Nazi collaborators and to sever diplomatic relations on April 25th, a step he really had already decided to take. But the primary goal of the British government all along remained to prevent the discovery of the mass murder of Poles from damaging Anglo-Soviet relations, and the behavior of Britain and the United States, both of whom quickly concluded that the Soviets, despite their denials, had committed this crime, consistently subordinated the interests of justice and truth for the Polish victims at Katyn to those of maintaining the wartime alliance until the final defeat of the Germans. The title, indeed, of one recent article best sums this attitude up: "Against Better Knowledge, the Silence of the Western Allies About Katyn." And ironically, the accommodating attitudes of Britain and the United States helped to persuade Stalin that they would insist on unconditional surrender, and he decided not to seek a separate peace with the Nazis, a viable option for him between the victories at Stalingrad in February and at Kursk in July. Only with the German people did Goebbels' propaganda of pessimism succeed. A series of recent histories of 1945 has focused on the cataclysmic murderousness of the months January through April, during which the German Wehrmacht suffered 1/4 of its total killed during the entire war. More German soldiers died January to April 1945 than died in all of 1942 and 43 combined. German civilians and soldiers alike bore the burdens of the bombing campaign and invasion, fighting to the end, both convinced of the barbarity of the Red Army and aware that Germany's own genocides meant that their enemies would show no mercy to the Germans. To conclude, this very farrago of propaganda, lies received as truth and truth dismissed as lies, that clouded the view of Katyn in 1943 and extended through much of the Cold War, is an example of the complexity that Timothy Snyder argues has blurred historians' vision of the experiences of the Bloodlands until the very recent past. As the shackles of the Cold War now recede more than 2 decades into the past, it's incumbent upon lawyers, historians, and statesmen alike to tell the story of the Katyn massacre in its fullest and richest context, as a matter of restorative justice and of mastery of the past, as our contribution to efforts to ensure that no bloodlands again blight the face of Europe. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm very grateful to Case Western University for assembling this very important conference on this very important topic, particularly to my friend Michael Scharf. It is, as Mr. Adamczyk said, a word, an event, a piece of history that should be so much more widely known. And perhaps our generation and this moment and this conference is part of an important turn in that direction. And I'm very honored to be part of this. My topic is Justice Robert H. Jackson in the Katyn forest. And of course, he, the American chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, in fact, never set foot in Katyn forest. So it is not a literal travelogue of any kind. It is instead a historical survey of a high official's responsibility, the prosecution effort at Nuremberg, and the historical accomplishment and failure of Nuremberg with regard to the truth on this topic. And I'm going to approach this in 3 parts. First, building on Ken's excellent scholarship and presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the crime, but the crime as it came to the knowledge of Robert Jackson as he was embarking on this Nuremberg assignment. Second, I'm going to speak about the Nuremberg trial to some degree, and I think in a sense, introduce Professor Schabas's presentation this afternoon, which will continue on that topic. Third, I'm going to consider the Nuremberg trial on trial, if you will, the after scrutiny that Nuremberg received for its treatment of Katyn and what was and wasn't done at Nuremberg. So, part 1, the crime. April 1943 is for the West, through the media, through Goebbels and the German announcement of the discovery in the Katyn forest, the moment of knowledge, the moment of zero becoming some increment of awareness. And Robert Jackson at that time is a U.S. Supreme Court justice. He's been on the court 3 years. He's a young lawyer of enormous public stature. He's not yet 50 years old, or I'm sorry, he's just turned 50 years old. And he has been up through Roosevelt's cabinet and then on to the Supreme Court, really the rising, leading lawyer, legal figure of this country in that generation. He was nearly the President of the United States, or at least the Democratic nominee in 1940. He was assumed to be likely to be, again, a presidential prospect or Chief Justice or something huge. And in the meantime, he was something huge. He was an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. He was the best pen on the court. And he was wrestling with the work of the court, which included a docket entirely unrelated to this Katyn news and this war context and the topic that we're here for today. Except it wasn't all separate, because Robert Jackson, like any responsible, serious person, citizen in that time, was an avid consumer of the news. And of course, his small world of contacts included the very top levels of the Roosevelt administration and the Supreme Court and so forth. So his front pages, Washington Post, Washington Times Herald, New York Times, Herald Tribune, et cetera, in those days, included the side-by-side stories that were the unfolding of the Katyn revelations and then the Russian denials, and alongside that, other events of April 1943. I don't think it's been mentioned, but if you pull up those front pages, you will see that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto occurs simultaneously with this revelation. So as we think of Bloodlands and Poland being sliced down the middle and East and West, those are adjacent stories, atrocities, information revelations in that month. And here's a glimpse of it in the work of Robert H. Jackson. Students of American constitutional law and history may know that one of his most famous opinions is the court's opinion handed down in June of 1943 in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. It is the court's invalidation on First Amendment freedom of expression and conscience grounds of the West Virginia state law that compelled school children to stand and salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. A similar law from the state of Pennsylvania had been upheld by the Supreme Court just 3 years earlier. And so the court, in this short interval, which includes the United States moving from uninvolved but an aid to Great Britain to involved in the World War, is a time of a jurisprudential switch on this issue. And Jackson and other new appointees and some justices who are changing their votes from the first case constitute the majority that Jackson writes for in the Barnett case. Now, Jackson was a very autonomous, very skilled writer, and his drafts of really everything survive, and you're able to watch his craftsmanship and his beautiful prose take shape. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite capture everything that's in the head or that's part of the intellectual process behind the drafting. But what one finds in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, handed down in June of 1943, but drafted in March and April and May of 1943, is two passages that I think reflect very tangibly the front page and the adjacent news items, atrocity, terror, war information that is part of his screen. One is the word ghetto, which he reaches out to use in the Barnett opinion. And it's not something one finds in any previous piece of his writing or that I've been able to find in any subsequent piece of his writing. It is a 1943 use of a word that is, of course, the Warsaw word. The other thing one finds is in his description of why we can afford to let Jehovah's Witness school children who have a religious scruple against saluting a graven object, even our own flag, choose that as a matter of conscience over a compelled patriotism, is because the American First Amendment order stands against compelled orthodoxy, compelled unanimity. The alternative, Jackson writes, and here I suspect I know what news item informs his pen as he's drafting. The alternative is the unanimity of the graveyard. Now, the most famous cemetery in the world, the graveyard of the spring of 1943, is Katyn. Part 2, Nuremberg. The Nuremberg assignment that comes to Justice Jackson comes from President Truman, who has succeeded Franklin Roosevelt, who had, of course, committed that the high Nazi perpetrators would be prosecuted as criminals after the war. And Roosevelt dies just before the Allied victory in Europe, and Truman inherits this plan and looks and follows everyone's consensus that the leading lawyer to embody this of stature and ability is Justice Jackson. It's inconceivable in our day that a president, I think, would pluck a sitting Supreme Court justice, not let him resign, tolerate him being AWOL for a year, and send him abroad to do something entirely executive branch in nature. But that's what it was because of who Jackson was. And that was a message across the alliance, principally to England and to the Soviet Union and to a lesser extent to the newly reconstituted French Republic, that this was a top-level serious responsibility, that this was, in a sense, the continuation of the military alliance, now leaving the field of war and moving to the restoration of law. And what those allies led by Jackson do is meet and do diplomatic work in London in the summer of 1945. They have to work out a shared system of law and architecture for creating a new international tribunal, all kinds of procedures about how it will operate. None of that had been laid as groundwork in advance. And so during the summer of 1945, across a square table at Westminster Abbey, Jackson, Russian counterparts, British counterparts, French counterparts work out what that fall comes to be Nuremberg. In those London discussions, they come to agreements about the crimes that are embodied in the August 1945 London Agreement. The principal crime is war itself. Conspiracy to commit it and other crimes is the concept of Nazism. And the related crimes are war crimes, historically well-established international norms of rules of law applying to war itself, The Hague, and etc., and the new concept of crimes against humanity. And it takes some very hard discussions and some sort of stare downs and threats to blow up the alliance before everyone agrees on what's really an American model. In those London discussions, which include many side discussions of potential defendants who have been captured, evidence that is being assembled, looking ahead to the trial, there is not, that I have found, a trace of a discussion of charging the Katyn massacre as a crime at what comes to be Nuremberg. So they've got these crimes, they've got this evidence, they've got these prisoners, they're on this march. Katyn is not part of this storyline. Into the fall of 1945, after they've selected the site, after they're assembling the evidence, as they're drafting the indictment, the Russians insert a sentence. Their proposal is to charge the Germans, as in, for American lawyers, a bill of particulars with, among many other things, the murders of over 900 Polish officers at Katyn. The drafting process is principally American and British in nature, but General Jan Nikitchenko is the Russian participant, and he keeps trying to insert this sentence. And the Brits, who really have the principal pen, keep redlining it and taking it out. Back and forth, and eventually, as a matter of Allied insistence, the Russians say, this is one of the things. Now, why don't the British and the Americans like the idea of charging this crime? Well, because as the newspapers and discourse has shown from 1943 up until this September 1945 moment, this is a disputed proposition. It is a he said, they say, back and forth. Unlike everything else that Robert Jackson and the British, subscribing to this plan, intended to base the case on, this one was not based on uncontested documentary evidence. The Germans had kept meticulous, thorough records and destroyed many, but not a lot. And that had been captured and analyzed, and that was the backbone of what Nuremberg was preparing to do. And to that, the Russians wanted to add something pointing to the Germans as the perpetrators of Katyn that, of course, didn't have smoking guns or other German documentation of the type that this trial was to be about. But alliance, deference, and comedy, I think, prevails, and that sentence remains in the proposed indictment. Jump to Berlin in October of 1945. The indictment is actually about to be officially filed before the tribunal. The Soviet staffing has changed. Nikitchenko has moved from the chief of counsel prosecutorial role to the chief judge role. Roman Rudenko has arrived from Moscow as the chief prosecutor, and he's the Russian chief prosecutor through the trial. And Rudenko, on the eve of the indictment's return, proposes to change the number. The 900 number now becomes an 11,000 number. And he's got an explanation that 900 was based on a sampling and a failure to do the multiplication based on the sampling, and etc. But now we're on the brink of returning the indictment, and Katyn, in its full false accusation against the Germans, is what the indictment contains. Again, at the 11th hour, privately behind the scenes, the Americans, the British, I think even the French, who were generally the passive fourth participant at Nuremberg, say, we don't need to include this. It's important to look at the Nuremberg indictment to see how small a piece it is and how, in a sense, and no insensitivity is intended by this, how surplus any particular sentence was. The criminal charges against the 24 individuals and the 6 organizations are spanning crimes. And then the sentences, if you will, are illustrative particulars, no one of which is required to demonstrate the waging of aggressive war, the commission of war crimes, the commission of crimes against humanity, or a common plan or agreement to engage in all of those crimes. And the indictment is quite a thick assemblage of particulars, illustrations, based on the captured documents. But any of those could have been dispensed with, just as this sentence for the theory of the case could have been dispensed with. But it's not. The charge is returned in October, and the trial begins in November. Jackson delivers the opening statement that is properly remembered as perhaps the most brilliant English language courtroom speech in history, and this sentence, this accusation, is not mentioned. Neither is it mentioned in the opening statements, which occur over a series of weeks, that the British chief prosecutor, the Russian chief prosecutor, and the French chief prosecutor deliver. In fact, the government's case, if you will, first the American case, which is the first two counts, the conspiracy and the waging of aggressive war, is entirely presented. The British case, which sort of, for shorthand, spans the same territory. The French case and the Soviet cases, which are territorial, East and West responsibilities for war crimes and crimes against humanity, are almost entirely presented without the word Katyn being breathed in the Nuremberg courtroom. Until February, very near the close of prosecutorial evidence, when a Russian assistant prosecutor, Comrade Pokrovsky, summarizes the finding of the Soviet white paper, the 1944, etc., blaming it on the Germans, Soviet report. He's presenting this pursuant to a provision of the London Agreement, which says the tribunal may take judicial notice of Allied government reports. And so he says we have a Russian report that said the Germans did Katyn. That's the end of the prosecution as it stands at that moment. The defense cases are about to begin. And here, in an ironic way, and I assure you my tongue is in my cheek, the hero of the truth about Katyn asserts himself. His name's Hermann Goering. And he tells his lawyer, Otto Stammer, the Wehrmacht did not do this. And you must defend the good name, I'm quoting Hermann Goering, of the Wehrmacht by challenging this charge. I authorize you to do it. I will assist you in doing it. And so Goering, defending himself, and he not particularly connected to any part of the Soviet white paper on the Germans did Katyn, authorizes his lawyer to make that part of the Goering defense. And Stammer begins to push. He first argues to the tribunal that I want witnesses. It takes months, but he's eventually granted witnesses. There's an attempt to negotiate that down to affidavits by the Soviets, and Stammer won't give up his ground. And at the very end of the trial, what the court authorizes is each side presenting 3 witnesses. We'll hear 3 from you on the defense side, and then we'll hear 3 from the Soviets on the prosecutorial side. And those are the last 6 witnesses who testify in the Nuremberg trial. And you'll hear more about it, but at that point, the word Katyn is never heard again. Not one of those 6 witnesses mentions any defendant. It's a flop. Stammer, if you will, succeeds in defending the good name of the Wehrmacht. Now, where is Jackson as the Russians are prosecuting this? Well, he is, of course, familiar with the public reports. He's also familiar with and getting little blips of input across the trial that this is still contested and we're not sure about the Russian charge against the Germans. There is information that Poles in the United States communicate through Jackson's son that the Russians did it. There's a cable that comes to him at Nuremberg in January of 1946 from Arthur Bliss Lane, the American ambassador in Warsaw, saying, actually, it may be the case that the Russians and the Germans did Katyn together. And there are contrary reports saying the Germans did it after all, but just little blips along the way. They don't know, and frankly, it's on the Russians anyway, so they don't have to figure it out. One other piece, Poland at Nuremberg. Actually in London, the Free Poles, and at Nuremberg, there are representatives who are interacting with Jackson, who are Poles, who are subscribers to the Nuremberg Project, who are supporters, and they don't take a particularly strong critical position against what the Russian prosecutors are doing. And that's interesting. They also are admiring, and of course this gets complicated with the history of Poland, but they are admiring of Jackson's accomplishments. So much so that in May of 1946, he is awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Warsaw. He's unable to make the trip to receive it in person but that's the Polish verdict, if you will, the Polish government verdict, and you know what that means by the spring of '46 on Jackson's performance. Now, an interlude before I get to part 3. In the fall of 1947, there is an enormous ceremony in Washington, D.C. at the Polish embassy, at which that degree is physically delivered to, conferred upon Justice Jackson. And that's really the end for him of Katyn, Nuremberg, Poland, etc., until it comes back. Part 3, the trial on trial. I can go quickly, and you'll hear more about this later, but the facts start to emerge. The truth starts to emerge. The drumbeat of the Russians did it becomes louder and louder. Books and press, including a book by Ambassador Lane, becomes part of this public discourse. And in 1951, Polish American constituency representatives from representing members of the U.S. House of Representatives passed the resolution that creates the Madden Committee. It's an honor that Representative Kaptur is here and Representative Kucinich was here earlier. The U.S. House of Representatives performs quite, I think, a heroic function in the performance of this committee. Its 1951 context is important to realize. It is McCarthyism, it is the Cold War, it is the Korean War, it is Polish-American political pressure for truth to be heard and justice to be done on Katyn, and it is the 1952 campaign of Dwight Eisenhower, who is a counterpart of sorts of Jackson's, and if Nuremberg is culpable of something on Katyn, this is an issue about Ike. Jackson, recognizing this context and being aware of this committee, knows what he needs to do. Just like in the Barnett case, he uncaps his pen and starts to write. Long before he's asked to testify, he begins to draft testimony. And over many months in the spring of 1952, we're 9 years down from his drafting of Ghetto and Unanimity of the Graveyard in Barnett, he's writing testimony about how Katyn was handled at Nuremberg. The hearings take a while to reach Jackson. Before they get to him, Robert Kempner, one of his assistant prosecutors at Nuremberg, testifies before Madden Committee hearings that are held in Frankfurt, Germany. He's asked, was Nuremberg a conspiracy among the Allies to pin on the Germans something you all knew the Russians had done? And Kempner says, not to my knowledge, you'd have to ask Jackson. A little bit of an odd phrasing, and he writes Jackson a very sheepish apologetic letter. I didn't mean that the way it came out. Another witness who testifies is Otto Stammer, Goering's lawyer. And he's asked, was Nuremberg an effort across the alliance, the Americans and the Brits in bed with the Russians, to pin it on the Germans? And Stammer says, God, of course not. The Americans, the British, Nuremberg was totally fair to me. They gave me discovery, they gave me resources. In fact, they paid him and they gave him housing. And they let me defend the Wehrmacht against this libelous charge that the Germans had done Katyn. All of that somewhat already diffuses the Nuremberg issue before the time Jackson testifies. But on November 11, think, by the way, historically about that day, on November 11, 1952, Jackson testifies before the Madden Committee. Supreme Court justices do testify on the Hill, but about budgets and Supreme Court renovations and so forth. It's quite unusual to have a substantive inquiry call a sitting Supreme Court justice, it's not a subpoena, he appears voluntarily, to explain his conduct. The Senate has confirmation hearings, and then that's usually the last time you get into a Supreme Court justice's past. Jackson comes to the committee and delivers powerful, direct, and I think fully satisfactory testimony. He's diffusing two misimpressions or charges that the House is bringing, really, against Nuremberg. One is this idea of conspiracy, that it was a cabal to pin it on the Germans. The other is a notion of underperformance. There's a bit of a legislative idea among the Madden Committee members that Nuremberg's job was to figure out who did it and to prosecute them. In fact, one of the members says, well, there were 4 nations, so if 3 of you had voted to turn around and indict the Russian guy sitting next to you, why didn't you do that? Well, the London Agreement is very clear. It's a 1-year project for Axis perpetrators of crimes. In other words, German criminals. The jurisdiction of Nuremberg did not allow the justice that the facts by this time were showing. And the Madden Committee demonstrates its, I think, ultimate satisfaction by, in its final report, quoting Jackson's final paragraph of his testimony. Jackson closed by saying, "This history will show, if it is now deemed possible to establish responsibility for the Katyn murders, nothing that was decided by the Nuremberg Tribunal or contended for by the American prosecution will stand in your way." And I think that's still true. Nuremberg did well on what it did, including ditching and abandoning the canard that the Soviets were prosecuting against the Germans with regard to Katyn. But Nuremberg was not for one time and all purposes a truth commission on Katyn. That remains, in a sense, our task. Jackson sent the Madden report in his testimony to his important counterparts, and I will close on this. He sent it to the British judges and prosecutors. He even sent it to a couple of French counterparts from Nuremberg. Interestingly, he did not send it to any of the Soviet counterparts. The curtain had come down on those former alliance relationships. And he got a letter back from Katyn Roberts. He got letters back from all of them. They were, transatlantic pen pals. But I want to read a sentence or two from Katyn Roberts' letter. He was an assistant British prosecutor. He's a former rugby star. He's the enormous man you see in Nuremberg pictures. You have a bunch of lawyers and then a giant. That's George D. Katyn Roberts. Khaki was his uniform color. And he writes back to Jackson, "Thanks for sending this statement about the wood of macabre and evil memory. I read it with the greatest interest and shall always keep it in my Nuremberg records. One of the great, quote, unsolved, close quote, and then parentheses, question mark, mysteries of history." They suspected, and over time, I think it's fair to say they more or less knew, they being the British, they being the Americans, the French as a trailer, that the effort to pin it on the Wehrmacht was wrong. And Nuremberg did justice by not allowing that Russian effort to succeed. Thank you.